So let me introduce Dr. Asta Audzijonyte to you. She's an ecological modeler and evolutionary biologist whose research focuses on understanding human impacts on marine and freshwater ecosystems. She's particularly interested in how global warming and fisheries are affecting size, growth, and reproduction of fish, and how these changes in fish size in turn change the ecosystems they live in. Dr. Audzijonyte is a research fellow at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies and a chief researcher at the Nature Research Centre in Lithuania. She completed a Master of Science in Zoology at the University of Vilnius in 2001 and a PhD in Molecular Ecology and Zoology at the University of Helsinki in 2006. In March 2020, Asta was awarded a Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation. So we're in for a really great afternoon, and I'm delighted to hand over to Asta. She talks to us about the human impacts on coastal fish size diversity. Over to you, Asta.
Thank you. Let's see now. It's a great pleasure to be here. If I start sharing my screen, hopefully it all works. Is it looking good, Kate?
It's looking great. Thanks, Asta.
Good, thank you. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Kate. We all have been having very unprecedented experience. People say this is an unprecedented time. The most popular word is unprecedented. So for me, it's also an unprecedented experience to give a lecture to a lot of participants without actually seeing them and without seeing my audience. But it's an interesting experience. So thanks a lot for this opportunity. And I'll be talking with you about a topic that's been at the core of my interest for many years already. It's how we affect the fish size diversity. So if we look at the marine ecosystems, if we look at the healthy ocean, we see a lot of amazing things. The first thing probably that attracts our eye is the color diversity, but also we usually notice the size diversity. We see that there are these small, medium size and big things all swimming in the ocean together. And that size diversity is extremely important in the ocean because marine ecosystems are amazingly size structured. Things depend on size. If you think about the land, the lions and the zebras remain in their roles. So the zebras don't eat small lions, and regardless of how big the zebras are, whereas in the marine ecosystems, depending on the size of a fish, the predator and the prey can swap the roles. So while the pike is maybe eating wrasse when the pike is big, but a small pike actually can be eaten by a really big wrasse, a tiny pike. So the size is really important for marine ecosystems. And as I already explained, size really matters to fish. It matters a lot because the size might determine whether you live or die. The smaller things, the smaller you are, the more likely you are to be eaten. The bigger you are, the more likely you will escape from predation and be able to eat others. And interestingly, while I was searching online for various pictures to illustrate the size, I found this funny article about monster flathead that gets too greedy and somehow, okay, he thought that it actually is bigger than it really is, and somehow it tried to buy too much that it could chew, but still, nevertheless, a very big flathead can actually eat lots of big fish. So size also matters for fish populations because bigger fish typically produce more eggs. This is part of the fairly recent research that it's been happening because traditionally we used to think that as the fish grow bigger, the proportion of spawn on the eggs that they produce is also increasing the same amount as its size. But it actually turns out that for many species, they produce a lot more eggs as they grow bigger. So for example, in this case of cod, one fish of the size of 30 kilograms can produce as many eggs as 37 smaller cod at the size of 2 kilograms. So basically the same amount of eggs either from one fish or either from 37 fish, or actually the total biomass of 74 kilograms. So these big individuals are really important for the population. They also are important in different ways in that the smaller fish that produce fewer eggs, they spawn over shorter periods of time, and the bigger fish spawn over longer periods of time. And you can imagine that only some periods will be useful and will be successful for these young larvae to survive. Sometimes there is like bad temperature or not enough food, and the bigger fish will have more chance, if it spawns over longer time, it will have more chance that its larvae will be successful in recruiting and surviving. And it's especially important with climate change, which increases unpredictability. So if, for example, that one period wasn't successful, we can see that the situation for the smaller spawners is not necessarily very good. We can also say, and that's for sure, that size of the fish is also important for us humans. People always are fascinated with big fish, either because you want to catch them in recreational fishing, or simply because swim with them and observe them and watch them. The size diversity is extremely interesting and satisfying to see. I mean, naturally, it is also important for fisheries, either it is artisanal fisheries or subsistence fisheries in developing countries or even commercial fisheries. Everything depends on size. And finally, I could also say that size is also important for the ecosystems, because some ecological roles can only be fulfilled by large animals. And here's some work that you might have heard about already, which has been at the very important project by the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, University of Tasmania, is the fact that now, as the climate is warming and long-spine sea urchins are spreading south into Tasmania and eating all the kelp and increasing urchin barrens, only large lobsters are able to control them. So even though we might have the same biomass of rock lobsters, if they are small, they actually cannot eat that urchin. Only big lobsters, which are above the minimum size limit actually, that are able to control them and are critically important to maintaining healthy ecosystems. So I hope I've convinced you that the size diversity of fish, of lobsters, of all the species in the ecosystems is very important, but these sizes are also changing. Humans are changing the size diversity. One way that we do it is, of course, through fishing. And that has been happening for many years already, ever since humans started fishing. Because if you think about the healthy natural population, it will consist of some medium, small, but also very big individuals. Because fish, unlike humans or birds or mammals, they keep growing throughout the whole lifetime. So if there are old fish, they are also very big fish in many cases. But as soon as fishing starts, these large individuals are the first ones to disappear. We catch them and we eat them, and it takes a while for them to get back to these big sizes. If the fishing is happening all the time, we will never actually have them. And indeed, so for example, we know these stories about 100 years ago, the sizes of fish that have been caught in the ocean, and including here in Australia, there are these stories about very large fishes that have been caught when the white people arrived. We don't see that very much anymore. So if you think about a size distribution, if you think on the x-axis, we see the size distribution of the fish sizes and how many numbers we can see in the ocean. This gray area on the left is something, the very small fishes. We actually can't observe them very well, so we don't exactly know how many there are. But the main thing is that right side hand of the graph is that in an unfished population, you will have this long tail of large fish. And as soon as we start fishing, that tail gets smaller and smaller. The average size changes. And the more intensively we fish, the more we are moving into that red zone. So most of the population consists of fairly young individuals, which do manage to reproduce. Obviously, otherwise the population will collapse. But we actually do lack that full size diversity. And there is another reason why humans are changing the fish sizes, and that is because of temperature. And that's because fish are ectotherms. Their body temperature depends on the environmental temperature. And so they are very sensitive. Their growth is very sensitive. it has been shown now for almost 100 years in experiments that if you raise a fish at warmer temperature, they grow initially faster as the juveniles, but they mature earlier and they reach smaller adult sizes. There are not all that many such general rules in ecology because nature is so variable, but this so-called temperature size rule has been observed in many cases consistently. So from this, we can expect that as the temperature gets warmer, the adult fish will actually get smaller. But it's not clear whether these experiments will apply to wild populations, because in experiments, fish are kept in perfect conditions, they get as much food as they want, and there are no predators. But in wild populations, as the temperature changes, lots of things will change. Predation will change, food availability will change, competition, there will be some adaptation, there will be lots of things that are changing. So can we extrapolate these experiments to wild populations? It's not clear. We need to get evidence from what is happening in nature, in wild populations. Until recently, most of the data we had was actually from commercially harvested species, because that's the data that was collected, only for species that are important for humans. And if you look at, we did a few reviews of commercially fished stocks from around the world where enough data was available, that indeed seems to be the case, is that over the last 30 to 50 years, adult size of fish is decreasing by 10 to even 20%, and they are maturing earlier. So this suggests that indeed fish might be getting smaller, and that's concerning. However, the problem with this is that these are all commercially fished species. So it's actually very hard to disentangle the effects of fishing from the effects of temperature. There are lots of different analyses done, and we can try to do it. Still, it's actually hard. So if only we could have data on all species, not only commercial species, but all species. And can we actually do it? The answer is yes, we can. And how can we do it? Through large-scale citizen science programs that are being now conducted all around the world. So this one, the main citizen science program that I'm using data from, is Reef Life Survey Global Database. It has started in 1992. The initial start of this program was in 1992 in Tasmania, actually, where as a temperate reef monitoring program. And so it was started by Graham Edgar, Neville Barrett, and other researchers, where they started regular underwater visual surveys. And in the last 10 years, this has expanded into the Reef Life Survey Citizen Science Program, where a lot of researchers and volunteer divers actually dedicate their time to collect this information. And the way it works is that it's a standardized method where 2 divers go through a 50-meter transect and record all the fish they see in these size groups. So it's a visual survey, and clearly the data is not necessarily as accurate, as precise as we see from commercially fished species that have been caught and measured with a ruler. But if we have a lot of that data, it's probably there are things that we can actually get from here. I'll just have to check if there is anything happening. Okay, in the chat. Okay, so we'll go back to the presentation. Right, so what we did, we concentrated on Australia, which had the largest numbers of surveys because that's where it all started. And so I pooled all of the existing surveys into half-a-degree grid cell. And so what you see here on this map is the summary of the surveys. We had about 20,000 of these surveys conducted by over 100 divers. And so I grouped them into 284 geographic cells and selected all common fish species in there, 335 species. And so we had about 10 million observations of these species over 29 years that have been conducted. And the color of this circle shows the mean annual water temperature. And the size of the circle shows how many species we actually had in that cell. So naturally, it depends on how many surveys there were, but also on the species diversity. The tropics are naturally much more diverse in species than the colder areas around Tasmania. And so with this data, we had a very simple question, which you would think would have been answered in the past, but it hasn't. So is the average fish size actually smaller in warmer waters of a species? So does temperature have an effect to the fish size in the wild? So the way we did it, we first looked at how the fish size changes in space. So let's say a banded monk lives all the way from Tasmania to somewhere around Sydney. And so it lives across the 7.5 degree gradient in space. So do average monks, are they on average smaller when it's warmer, or are they on average colder when it's warm? Are they on average bigger when it's warmer? How does it correlate? And once we have that information, we can say, when we look at these long-term monitoring locations, so in these locations, we had data of up to 28 years of surveys. And many of them over these 28 years have undergone quarter degree of warming. So in these locations, are average fish sizes changing or not? And the reason these locations have warmed up so much over the last 30 years is that the whole ocean is warming, like the whole Earth is warming, but the Southwest Australia and Southeast Australia are in one of these global warming hotspots because they are warming faster than the rest, the 90% of the ocean. And especially if you see in the Tasmania, the average warming is 0.1 degree per decade. So it's actually really rapid warming. So, which gives us an opportunity to see what happened over the last 30 years as the temperature warmed. So this analysis took a long time, a couple of years, intermittently with trying to find the best way to look at this data. And most of it can be summarized in this one picture, which looks complicated, but I'll try to explain. Basically, each dot here shows a different species, and the color of this dot shows whether the species are warming or whether they're getting smaller or whether they're getting bigger with warmer temperature. And these species are ranked from the smallest on the left side to the biggest on the right side. So we actually go all the way from tiny fish like hula fish, which are 10, 15 centimeters big maximum, to large groupers and dusky morlong and other fish, which grow to really big sizes. And the line above, up and down the circle, shows the level of uncertainty that we have. In science, we always have some uncertainty. In some cases, we are quite certain. If this line is colored, for example, here we see all these purple species are actually getting smaller as the temperature in warmer part of their distribution, because on the left axis you can see how much they are smaller with each degree of warming. So if it's 0.1 minus 0.1, they're actually 10% smaller on average with each degree of warming. So we see a lot of species are sort of at around 3 or 4% smaller with each degree of warming through space. And then there are some species that are getting bigger with each degree of warming. So they are the yellow species. But we also have this orange line going here, which basically shows that the small-bodied species, like this plankton hula fish and the other tiny species, they are more likely to be purple. They are more likely actually to be smaller in warmer temperatures, and the large-bodied species are more likely to be bigger. So this is a very unexpected finding, because generally it was expected that the result will be the opposite, that the bigger bodied species are actually the most vulnerable one. And now we can actually ask the next question. So if a species is smaller at the warmer part of its distribution, is it also more likely to get smaller as the ocean warms? So that is the main question that we wanted to get to. Can we use that space information to predict what's happening in time? And the answer is, it seems that yes, we can, at least to approximately we can actually do it, because this is a graph that basically shows on the x-axis, if the species is getting smaller in time as the temperature warms, and whether the species is getting smaller in space as the temperature warms or bigger. So it shows that these relationships, these changes are correlated. And what we basically can see, our finding is that we can use that space information, distribution information across the species distribution to predict how it is going to change through time as the ocean warms. But another interesting finding is that the size changes through time were considerably faster. In fact, if we extrapolate directly, they were 10 times faster than the changes of size through space. So for example, we found that on average, each species changes in length by about 3 to 4% with each degree of warming through space. But in time, a quarter degree of warming, for example, near Maria Island, led to 10% change in length. So that's a huge change. 10% in length actually leads to almost 30% in the biomass and weight. So that's a big effect on species, and many species are actually changing. For example, if we look at the most common species along the Tasmanian coast here, Tasmania is relevant for us, we find that majority of them actually did show some significant trends through time. So for example, on the top row, we see some species that are getting bigger, which is the razor perch or the pike, but a lot of species are actually getting smaller, even though overall we saw that there is about the same amount of species that are bigger and smaller, yet in Tasmania, just the species that are here happen to actually quite often be getting smaller. So what we actually find that some species are getting bigger, some species are getting smaller. In Tasmanian cases, in Maria Island, for example, which is the data here, a lot more of them are getting smaller than bigger. But this uneven distribution of size changes, what does it mean? So some people tell me, so then it's okay. So everything will be balanced because some species will get bigger, others will get smaller. Maybe, we actually don't know. But as the species are changing in size, their relationship, their interactions with all other species are also changing. And we did explore that a few years ago with an ecosystem model, where we tried to see what happens if you actually make some species smaller in size. We didn't make other species bigger, we actually just left them at the same size, but we made some species smaller, and not very much smaller. We only made them about 2 to 4% smaller in length. So this is what we see in Tasmania over whatever, 5 years. It's about, in some species, it's about 1% change in length per year. And so if we make them about 2 to 4% smaller, we explore 2 scenarios, what we found is that their biomass decreased. So these bars, the blue and red bars, show how much the biomass, the total weight in the ocean, changed over this time. So for example, for wahoo in the middle, the red bar shows that as the species got smaller by 4% in length, the biomass decreased by almost 35%. And the main reason for that is that predation mortality from main predators actually increased a lot. And that's partly because of the size-based interaction, is that the predator and the prey can change their roles depending on how big they are. So we found that, for example, as the sizes change, we get these positive feedback loops. One of them, what the model suggested, what could be happening in the ocean, is that, for example, if the tiger flathead is changing in size, its interaction with the main predator, like barracuda, for example, the piscivore, will also change. So initially, the big flathead eat tiny barracudas, but the large barracudas eat flathead. But as the flathead gets smaller, they can't eat as many barracudas, so there are more bigger barracudas, which then eat even more flathead, which then have even less effect on the barracudas. And these interactions are reinforcing each other, having a big effect on flathead, which got smaller by 4%. Another way how these interactions could change is actually prey switching. So the model suggested one option could be is that the tiger flathead eats school whiting, and the cephalopods eat a bit of flathead, but they also eat school whiting. But the really big school whiting can actually eat tiny flathead. And as the flathead gets smaller, they eat a bit less of the whiting, so there are more big whiting, which can have a bigger effect on tiny flathead, but it also means that it's harder for cephalopods to catch them, and instead they eat more flathead, which is now smaller. So again, we get these positive feedback loops in the ecosystem that reinforce each other, and just a small change in length can actually have a big effect on the weight, on the numbers and biomass of the flathead. And in a very simplified way, we could say that there are these alternative ecosystem states. Early on, we had a big flathead that could eat cephalopods and whiting, and the alternative state is that the flathead got smaller and now it's eaten by cephalopods and by huge whiting. Well, this is a simplification, but it's just to illustrate how this system can actually switch into these alternative states. So it's clear that a lot of fish sizes are really changing. And that leads to a lot of questions. How general it is that we found. Does it apply globally? We think it does, but that remains to be tested. What are the mechanisms? Why do some species get bigger, others get smaller? Is it because of growth or mortality, or is it food availability? We don't know actually what exactly is driving it, and what are the consequences? What is it going to mean for the ecosystems? So all of these questions still remain, a lot of work to be done. Some of this work will be done through my new fellowship, which has been recently granted to me, and I'm honored to join an international team of Pew Fellows. And I will finish this talk with a short video that I made to explain, what I'm going to do in this fellowship. So hope it's working well and that you enjoy watching it. I often wonder how the ocean looked like a few hundred years ago, with amazing diversity of species and sizes of fish. This diversity has been affected by fishing, and we know that global warming is going to make things worse. We know that changing temperatures are changing the sizes of fish, yet we do not know yet how that will affect marine ecology and fisheries. My project aims to help understand that and hopefully reduce our impacts. My name is Asta Audzijonyte. I'm a scientist, and I study how humans are changing the oceans. I'm passionate about the natural world, and I've dedicated my career to help us understand the ocean secrets better and to use that knowledge to help reduce our impacts. I'm especially interested in understanding how fishing and global warming are changing growth and sizes of fish in the ocean. This project will harness information collected through the vast number of fish surveys now available from global citizen science projects such as Reef Life Survey and new technology from underwater cameras. I will use this data to develop new knowledge and maps of coastal fish size diversity and identify areas where humans are having the greatest impact. Most importantly, the project aims to show what this size diversity looked like in the past and how it could look like in the future if we allow ecosystems to recover. Big fish have always fascinated humans. We have a lot of stories about brave fishers tackling that biggest fish. But fish size diversity is also extremely important for the marine ecosystems. If you think about it, a big tuna behaves very differently from a small tuna. They eat different things, they reproduce over longer periods of time, and they often have more energy reserves to keep them going through low food periods. Yet fishing has affected fish diversity in the ocean. If the entire fish stock consists of small individuals, which is often the case now in intensively fished areas, this stock doesn't behave in the same way. It doesn't play the same role in the ocean compared to the stock that has small, medium, and large fish. Natural ecosystems can recover amazingly fast if we let them, and I hope one day in my lifetime we will again see and enjoy this amazing diversity of big and small fish alike.
Well,
And with
thank you.
this, I'll
Thank you,
just
Asta.
thank to all the co-authors and all the colleagues who worked with me. Everything is done in big teams. It's never one person's work. So
Thank you so much, Asta. That was really, really wonderful. And perhaps the nature of your subject means that we're truly stunning photography and images there. Gosh, really, really wonderful. And actually a very challenging subject in many ways. So look, it's really wonderful. Well, I was noticing as Asta was speaking, we have people on the lecture from all around the world, which is a real advantage actually to our online program and timing at this time of day, that we can have so many people from literally all around the world listening in. This is your moment to ask Asta any questions, so please do use the Q&A button to field any questions that you might have for Asta. But perhaps while people are thinking about the questions they'd like to ask, Asta, I'm just curious, how did your interest in this research field first begin?
well, I think the very interest started with evolutionary biology questions of how fishing might be affecting the sizes of fish in the long term. I was interested in fisheries-induced evolution, and whether by the fact that we are always catching the biggest fish, we in fact are making fish smaller and smaller. However, as always in life, things turned out to be a lot more complicated than you think. And so there are all these complex interactions. It's fishing and it's temperature. So it's a lot of exciting things to find out, or I don't know, exciting and sad in some ways because of climate change.
So that's interesting. And thinking about sort of fishing and sort of global interest in fishing, perhaps no more so than in Tasmania or indeed Australia. What are the implications for both sort of casual leisure fishers, but perhaps also our fisheries and food security?
Well, this is a big question, and that's one of the remaining questions that we actually should be studying. It's hard to know what the implications are because we haven't actually looked how our standard stock assessments, we haven't looked enough, I think, to how stock assessments would react if the fish sizes are changing. What do we know? However, one thing I did wanted to mention is that still, compared to many other places around the world, Australia is really lucky in that human impacts from fishing on coastal ecosystems are not as huge as in many other places. So we could actually do this study because a lot of species are not intensively fished. So we could actually separate those effects of fishing and temperature. And that was really interesting and unique.
Thank you. Now, questions come in, Asta, which is talking about volunteer surveyors. I'm not sure if, can you see the questions, or I'll read it out to you.
Okay, yes.
You can see around volunteer surveyors' tools for self-checking their ability to estimate fish size accurately underwater. So it's really a question about methodology and accuracy, calibration, and so forth.
That's a very natural question. That's the first thing that I thought as well. And in fact, even the people who designed and did this work, we're not sure whether we will be able to actually detect this effect of size, small changes in size, given that they actually just visual surveys underwater. So to say, first of all, yes, there is a lot of self-checking. There is a lot of training. They actually do regular training with rulers underwater and trying to train themselves to estimate the size correctly. And there are some papers about it showing how repeatable it is and what the biases are. But when we did this analysis, we took that into account in a way that we had a lot of random effects that try to remove the effect of this different error from the surveyors and from lots of other factors that might actually be affecting the fish size, because it wasn't only temperature. So you can look at the paper. It's published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, or you can email me and I'm happy to talk about it more.
Thank you. I mean, you talked earlier in your presentation with some quite staggering volumes of data. I think you said something around 10 million observations. Was that right? My mind boggles. I'm not an academic, but how do you actually manage that volume of data?
Yes, it is indeed amazing. So it's just a large data sets. If you are if you're dealing with advanced statistical methods, you can deal with that. And I mean, that's a pleasure to work with large data sets because you can start seeing these patterns, which you normally wouldn't be able to see in a relatively noisy data, because of course we have a lot of noise in a way that people see things slightly different, all the noise that we need to account for. So yeah, I think it's just the fact that there have been a lot of surveys, a lot of divers who dedicated the time, amazing program, and that in some places it has been going on for almost 30 years. So thanks a lot for people who managed to get it going.
I was going to say, I should think in some academic fields, they'd be very envious of that amount of being able to call upon that amount of data and having that many people interested in
so
helping
that data
in this
actually,
way.
just to say, this is Reef Life Survey is an open access data. So all of that data is available basically for people to use. So it's not, yeah. And there is a lot of work a lot of research that came out of it.
So if people wanted to get involved in that, how would they go about that?
Well, to start with, you can go to Reef Life Survey website, and there are contact information. There is contact information, and yeah, just start with that.
They can just get started.
Or they can contact me if there is interest in temperature effects.
And so, you know, when we think about those human impacts, and you talked in your presentation about, you know, how much is still to know. We don't really know where all this is leading. But I wonder, as a scientist, whether you feel, in the context of the sort of global issues around climate change, the impacts that humans have on the planet, do you feel ultimately optimistic about what it is that you're seeing, that we might be able to, human behavior might be able to change sufficient to maintain the right balances in the ocean? Or are you in a sort of...
That's such a difficult question. I think a lot of scientists working with climate change are actually struggling to remain optimistic. Things often look very, very dire and much worse than presented in the media. People say that media is saying that things are bad, but things are actually looking even worse. However, I do try to be optimistic. In some way, the COVID-19 situation, even though it is really awful, it actually gives hope that we might be able to get together and act on important things. And the governments might be able to suddenly find money and act on important things, on very important things. So yes, I do try to stay optimistic. And I finish my video saying that ecosystems can recover fast. So we just need to want to do it and to give them a chance.
Well, let's hope so. So another question's come in here, Asta, if you can see the screen, asking about whether commercial fisheries are changing their behaviours in light of this research, or whether we're seeing any local, state, or federal laws coming into place. What's your comment on that?
We have been actually trying, and not only it's a lot of researchers around the world are trying to convince commercial fishing and laws that we actually need to try and protect the size diversity, and not only have a minimum catch limits, but also maximum maybe catch limits. So to make sure that we are not taking these biggest individuals all the time, that we actually have some way how we are trying to keep that size diversity. This hasn't been very successful so far in the world. In some places, this has happened. In other places, it seems to be very slow, because one thing is science, and as we know, putting that into practice becomes much harder because there are a lot of hurdles. Marine protected areas, of course, are critically important here, because that's the place, proper marine protected areas, where no fishing is allowed at all, because even the small amount of fishing will actually affect that size diversity. They will take out these big individuals. So they play a hugely important role actually in maintaining that diversity and allowing this big fish to survive and contribute in all sorts of ways. So I hope that there will be more impact on changing laws, changing effects, but that's a big topic, which is not only based on science, but also based on a lot of social things and politics. I saw there was another question about size bins. So here we go. Oh, there were a few questions that I've actually haven't even noticed. So learning how to give talks remotely. So yes, so this is reported on in size bins, but if you actually do across many species, and so basically we use the regression methods, and so no matter how the size bins are reported, you can still infer by year, because let's say even though we have size bins over 30 years, when we do a regression analysis, we can see what would be an average change for each year. So this is just based on linear regression extrapolation. And again, this is a methodological question that I'm very happy to discuss, and we did a lot. Now, if I'm missing something,
No, so there's a question here regarding mechanisms behind the temperature size rule, whether you think earlier maturation plays as much of a role as physiological constraints, so metabolism, for example,
so this is
temperatures.
one of the huge topics about what is driving the temperature size rule. Why is it really happening? So because I'm an evolutionary biologist, for me, it seems that it's the earlier maturation that will have a very big effect, because as individuals get mature earlier, they allocate more energy into reproduction and they have less energy for growth. So, but again, this is one of the topics that need to be investigated more. We're actually doing that in collaboration with researchers at University of Melbourne, where we are doing 5 generations of experimental work where we keep fish at different temperatures and actually see what is happening, and with different fishing regimes. So we're trying to get to these mechanisms. It's not necessarily easy, but hopefully science will move into that direction.
And Brigitte in our audience has asked, how long does it usually take for a marine ecosystem to recover after fishing is banned completely?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it depends on how much change in that ecosystem happened. And first of all, we don't even know how far it needs to recover. One of the problems is that in many cases, we actually lost the knowledge of what that ecosystem would even look like originally without the human impact. So, however, the initial recovery, sort of the recovery of the size structure, happens relatively fast if it depends on how long the fish lives. So if it's, let's say, a fish that lives up to 20 years, so you will recover that full size and age structure within the next 20 years. You give them a few years and they grow and grow bigger, so you will accumulate that full age diversity and size diversity of individuals. However, if we get these alternative states, so for example, we have urchin barrens because the urchin ate all the kelp, it can be very hard to move the system back into the kelp forest without human effect. You imagine you have these different bumps, and you actually, to get from one valley into another, you have to climb a big mountain. So that's actually, in this case, that recovery may not be necessarily all that easy. It's the same as if you clear the forest, it becomes a desert, for example. It's very hard to return it back into the forest. So these alternative states are difficult. So we hope we are not entering them too soon, or we hope not many places have actually moved into these other states, and so that the recovery is possible. So depends how much of the recovery. But even I think 10 years, so what marine protected areas have shown, even 10 years give you big effects already. And the longer it stays protected, the better the impacts are.
I think that brings us back to our kind of earlier question around reasons to be optimistic and hopeful. So one of the people who are listening into the lecture has asked, well, they've said that they're starting to learn about physiology and marine biology, and has asked whether you would consider that changes in sizes would somehow alter the way certain fish metabolize contaminants from the water.
Yes, that's a very good question, because I haven't actually thought about it very much, but I know that this is a large topic. And yes, I imagine that might be possible. One of the questions to find out, because small individuals have different metabolic rates, they have different energy intake rates, energy usage rates than large individuals. I think that is likely to be the case. And I think that this uptake will depend on size of the individuals. Okay, have you been able to assess interactions of warming and fishing? So in this analysis, we did a lot of that, trying to compare how things work inside and outside MPA. So it's amazing that we did have some areas, some surveys inside marine protected areas and outside marine protected areas. And while we did find that marine protected areas did have an important effect, yet this effect of temperature was, of course, seen both inside and outside marine protected areas. So we did some of that work as well, trying to compare different protection levels and to see how the temperature affects them. So the temperature is actually having effect in both. But another thing is that a lot of these species that we observe are not actually fish. They are like pufferfish, or they are other small species. In fact, only about I don't remember now, 50 or something like that, of 335 species are the ones that are likely to be recreationally fished. So that was, for reviewers of this study, that was sort of an interesting thing, because that's not the case in, let's say, Mediterranean or in other densely populated places.
Well, thank you, Asta. I think I will just pause for a moment or two in case anyone who's joining us on the lecture has any final questions for Asta. But this might be a moment for me just to express a few thanks. Thank you to the advancement team who have coordinated the lecture. Thank you to all of you around the world who've taken the time to join this lecture. But I think at this point, I'd particularly like to, if you could imagine a loud clap around the world,
Yes,
Dr. Audzijonyte, for your time and for a really interesting and very topical subject. It's been very interesting and a great contribution to our Island of Ideas lecture program. Thank you